नमस्कार सभी को, वेलकम टू माय प्लेलिस्ट ऑन हिंदुइज्म एंड टुडे वी आर गोइंग टू टेक एन एटिक इंट्रोडक्शन टू हिंदुइज्म। तो पहले तो इस वर्ड एटिक का मतलब जानते हैं। व्हाट एग्जैक्टली डू आई मीन बाय एटिक इंट्रोडक्शन? सो बाय रिलीजियस स्टडीज़ या फिर एंथ्रोपोलॉजी, इसमें दो प्रकार के पर्सपेक्टिव्स होते हैं और अप्रोचेस टू स्टडी अ रिलीजन और अ पर्टिकुलर कल्चर। पहला जो अप्रोच होता है उसको कहते हैं एटिक। इसका मतलब है आउटसाइडर्स एनालिटिकल व्यू पॉइंट, मतलब कोई भी एक स्कॉलर या फिर कोई भी ऐसा बंदा जो इस ट्रेडिशन का भाग ना हो, हु डजेंट एक्सपीरियंस द ट्रेडिशन फर्स्ट हैंड, इज नॉट अ पार्ट ऑफ दैट ट्रेडिशन और रिलीजन और कल्चर। व्हेन दिस पर्सन स्टडीज द रिलीजन, वो कैसे ऑब्जर्व करेगा? सो दिस इज बेसिकली एन आउटसाइडर्स एनालिटिकल व्यू पॉइंट, यूजुअली टेकन बाय स्कॉलर्स। दूसरा जो अप्रोच है उसे कहते हैं एमिक अप्रोच। एमिक अप्रोच इज बेसिकली टेकन बाय प्रैक्टिशनर हु इज़ अ पार्ट ऑफ दैट ट्रेडिशन। सो एक जो बंदा है वो उस ट्रेडिशन में रह के उस ट्रेडिशन को कैसे एक्सपीरियंस करता है, दैट इज़ रेफर्ड टू एज द एमिक पर्सपेक्टिव और द इनसाइडर्स पर्सपेक्टिव। सो ये मोस्टली फिनोमिनोलॉजिकल होता है एंड दिस इज एनालिटिकल। एक ऑब्जेक्टिव है और दूसरा सब्जेक्टिव है। एंड यूजुअली इन द basically in the intersection of both of these approaches is probably where a truth about a religion or a culture exists, or the interpretation or the understanding of a culture exists. So ये दोनों है। अभी I'm going to introduce you with the etic approach. The reason why I'm taking an etic approach is because मैं कोई भाष्यकार या फिर कोई आचार्य नहीं हूँ, so I cannot give you an emic approach, क्योंकि एमिक में आचार्य और भाष्यकार भी आते हैं, basically the priest or the scholarly people of that particular tradition. So I will give you an etic introduction जो रिलीजियस स्टडीज़ के स्कॉलर्स लेते हैं टू स्टडी द कल्चर। सो व्हाट इज़ माई मोटिवेशन इन दिस? वेल, बेसिकली मेरे दो मोटिवेशन है। द फर्स्ट इज़ बहुत से हिंदुओं को आजकल, प्रैक्टिसिंग हिंदुओं को, फिलोसॉफी ऑफ हिंदुइज्म पता ही नहीं है। सो आई वांट टू एजुकेट देम अबाउट द फिलोसॉफी ऑफ वैदिक हिंदुइज्म। और दूसरा मोटिवेशन ये है कि बेसिकली टू इनकलकेट एन एटीट्यूड ऑफ स्टडिंग रिलीजन एंड नॉट जस्ट प्रैक्टिसिंग इट, कि ठीक है भाई आप प्रैक्टिशनर तो हो, देन बट ट्राई टू स्टडी the religion, its culture, its philosophy. So that is what I want to inculcate in the people. So these two are my motivations for this playlist. So now this brings us to understanding what constitutes religion in Indian terminology. So basically when we consider religion, we might think of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Shintoism, Taoism, Confucianism, many religions in the world. But when you try to look at it from an Indian perspective, there is one particular thing that is common to all the major Indian religions, that is Sikhism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. They are indigenous to the Indian subcontinent. So what is that common thing? Well, the common thing is all of these three religions believe in three concepts. When I say three religions, I mean Jainism, Buddhism, Hinduism, because they are the earliest. Sikhism evolved way later. So let's talk about the elder three: Jainism, Buddhism, and Hinduism. So isme they all believe in the concept of samsara, that is the cycle of birth and death. They all believe in the concept of dharma, and they all believe in the concept of karma, right? So together, all the three religions, Jainism, Buddhism, and Hinduism, believe in these three concepts. Abhi in shabdon ke interpretation un religion mein alag ho sakti hai. All of them have a doxastic attitude of belief towards these three concepts. So together we can call this as the dharmic manifold, because all of them believe in the concept of dharma, karma, and samsara, the cycle of birth and death. So in the dharmic manifold, obviously we have Vedic Hinduism, which is the eldest of these three religions. So let's talk about Vedic Hinduism or Hinduism in general. Now usually to understand a particular religion, अगर हम Hinduism देखेंगे उसमें बहुत सारे संप्रदाय है, बहुत सारे देवी देवता है, and then we have the central Vedic tradition, Vedika parampara. Then how can we understand the evolution and how can we define something called as Hinduism if it is so fragmented? And this is like a common argument which is offered against Hinduism, कि Hinduism कोई एक religion as such नहीं है. It's basically just a conglomerate of multiple things. That's actually not the case. And in religious studies, we can apply two models to understand how religions evolve and what religions are. So the first thing is called the arboreal model, and the second is a river model. So the first represents the arboreal model. इसका मतलब ये है कि कोई तो एक common source होता है उस particular religion का, probably the founder, and all of the denominations and their teachings can be traced back to that one founder and his teachings or her teachings. So there is a root, which is the common source, and from these teachings there are multiple denominations it branches out into multiple sects. For example, if you consider Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Jainism, all of them can be explained by the arboreal model because they have a single founder. On the other hand, if you consider Hinduism, we can say that somehow Vedas are the source, but then Vedic Hinduism or Hinduism in general also has sectarian beliefs, sampradaya. For example, we have Vaishnavism, Shaivism, Shaktism, Ganapatya, and then we have also many of the local indigenous traditions that were later assimilated into Hinduism. So clearly, we cannot use the arboreal model to explain Hinduism. So what we do is we go with समथिंग कॉल्ड द रिवर मॉडल. इसका मतलब यह है कि जैसे नदियों की शाखाएं एक साथ मिलकर या फिर संगम होने के बाद एक बड़ी नदी बन जाती है, उसी तरह वी कैन एक्सप्लेन हिंदुइज्म. सो वी आर गोइंग टू अप्लाई द रिवर मॉडल to understand what Hinduism is, the umbrella of Hinduism. So as I said before, in that case, we need to define what Hinduism is. Is there a Hinduism? How do we define it? Now, several definitions have been given throughout history by notable figures. For example, one of the definitions is given by Jawaharlal Nehru. He says, Hinduism is all things to all men. Now, the problem with this definition is that it's too inclusive. It doesn't give any information about Hinduism whatsoever. ये बहुत ही trivial definition है. This doesn't tell me anything about Hinduism. So naturally, this is a much broader and honestly trivial definition of Hinduism. It doesn't define anything what Hinduism is. So ये definition काम में नहीं आएगी. Then we have the definition given by V.D. Savarkar, Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. That is more like a religious, cultural, political definition, if you can call it that. So basically a definition ये है कि असंधु सिंधु पर्यंता यस्य भारत भूमिका पितृभु पुण्यभुश्चैव सवै हिंदुर इति स्मृतः. So इस definition के basically 3 condition ये है कि Hinduism is basically something, or rather a Hindu is someone who considers India to be their fatherland, Pitrubhumi, and they should descend from Hindu parents whose lineage can be traced all the way back to the Vedic lineages and families. So that's basically the second condition. And the third condition is that they should consider or they should acknowledge the cultures, practices, rituals, traditions of the Indian subcontinent. तब जाके तुम हिंदू हो जाओगे. That's basically a general idea of Savarkar's definition. The problem here is, what if there is someone who is not descending or who does not originate in the Indian subcontinent? Let's say someone from Europe who is a Caucasian male and he wants to adopt the Hindu practice. He wants to convert to Hinduism. In that case, the second condition of descending from Hindu parents, which can be traced all the way back to the Vedic lineages, that fails. So would that person be not counted as a Hindu? So yeah, in that case, it's kind of a restrictive definition, at least geographically, if you talk about it. So इसलिए ये भी definition हम use कर सकते हैं, but I would call it, okay, this definition works, it's a working definition, but we need to refine it more. He says that, well, Hinduism is basically the acceptance of the ultimate validity of the Vedas, multiplicity of the ways of worship, and lack of restriction on the divinity that one may worship. This is a very interesting definition because this brings out the very nature of what Hinduism is. Multiplicity of the ways of worship and the lack of restriction. कोई भी restriction नहीं है किसी भी देवता की पूजा करने के लिए. And this thought is reverberated even in Hindu practice. Even for example in sectarian Hinduism, Vaishnavism में हम कहते हैं कि सर्वदेव नमस्कारः केशवं प्रति गच्छति. So yeah, in some sense we can accommodate this definition as well. And there are more definitions which are given by scholars of religious studies. For example, this one is given by Brian Smith. He was a scholar in religious studies. And he basically says, Hinduism is the religion of those humans who create and transform traditions with legitimizing reference to the authority of the Ved. Legitimizing reference. So ये बहुत ही interesting definition है because this combines 2 things. We agree that Hinduism is basically something that creates traditions based on the authority of the Ved, but it also transforms the existing traditions with legitimizing reference to the authority of the Ved. So for example, this talks about local indigenous traditions which were later assimilated or integrated into Vedic Hinduism. And they try to establish or legitimize their deity to the authority of the Ved. So for example, if you consider Ganapati Upanishad, probably it was composed by the followers of Ganapati Sampradaya. And in Ganapati Upanishad, first half, they are trying to superimpose the attributes of Brahma on Ganapati to show that their deity is equal to the deity of the Upanishad. And in the second half of Ganapati Upanishad, they are talking about the description of Ganesh. So this is how they try to incorporate their deities into the Vedic Hinduism. So this is what I mean by transforming traditions with legitimizing reference. So that's an example of what Brian Smith is talking about. So yes, definitely this is a good definition. And we can say, okay, using this definition, we can say that there is a Hinduism, an umbrella, a Hinduism, which basically has multiple traditions embedded into it. So as I said, yes, we can say that there is something called Hinduism, which is good. So then what constitutes Hinduism? Well, as I said, there is a central framework, which is basically the Vedic Hinduism, we can call it the Vedic religion. And then there were some indigenous traditions, like local indigenous traditions. Let's call them L1, L2, L3, L4. They existed and Vedic Hinduism existed together. This constitutes the umbrella of Hinduism. What happened over time is that these local traditions were subsumed into the Vedic Hinduism, not unwillingly. They tried something called as integration. And this is a very famous phenomenon in religious studies. This is actually a part of a bigger concept or idea called as acculturation, which means some local groups basically would try to integrate themselves in the dominant cultural group. And this is done willingly. So that is why, for example, if we see Balaji, or if we see Jagannath Puri, or if we see Vitthal, for example, in Maharashtra, all these might have been local deities which were later assimilated or acculturated, integrated into Vedic Hinduism. Or if you take the reference of Krishna, for example, we see that Krishnaism is also something, and that was later incorporated into Vedic Hinduism. And that was done willingly because the dominant culture of the time was Vedic Hinduism, and they had explicit ontology, soteriology, ritualism, and these people might have been impressed by this. And so they tried to incorporate their religion or their traditions and beliefs into Vedic Hinduism so that it would have some authority. So ये हुआ है Hinduism के case में. And as I said, the keyword over here is acculturation. So this is more like a social phenomena, and this happened with many of the religions. For example, जब Buddhism East Asia में गया, then the same thing happened. The local traditions were assimilated or integrated into Buddhism. So it achieved an interesting syncretism between Buddhism and Shintoism, या फिर Buddhism and Taoism, या फिर Buddhism and Confucianism. So this happens all the time, and this is a phenomenon in religious studies and even in sociology, by the way. So that brings us to the next question. That, okay, now we know that there is something called Hinduism, and Hinduism consists of the Vedic orthopraxy and some local traditions which were later integrated into Vedic Hinduism. But since that happened, many deities exist in Hinduism. Some even say 33, some say 330 million. So how do we incorporate this? How do we understand what category does Hinduism belong to? Is it polytheistic, multiple gods, worship of multiple gods? Or is it monotheistic, which means worship of just one single god? Ab kuch Oriental scholars the, and they are very famous. One of them is Max Muller, and he believed that Hinduism is actually henotheistic or cathenotheistic. इसका मतलब ये है कि it accepts the existence of all gods, it believes in the existence of all gods, but eventually or occasionally one god is considered to be superior. So for example, in Vaishnavism, Vishnu is superior, in Shaivism, Shiva is superior, but they don't reject the existence of other deities. They acknowledge the existence of other deities, but they consider their deity to be superior. So that's called cathenotheism, या फिर henotheism, and this was considered by Max Muller. But then we have another scholar, Surendranath Dasgupta. He actually argues that it has elements of both polytheism and monotheism. And this is like the standard interpretation which is given in Western academia about Hinduism, that initially Hinduism was polytheistic or animistic, और धीरे धीरे वो monotheism के तरफ बढ़ा. By the end of, let's say, 10th mandala of Rigved, we see Prajapati as a monotheistic creator. Then we have verses like Purusha Sukta and stuff like that. So that gives, basically that insinuates monotheism, single deity worship. और उसके बाद in the Upanishad, we can see the rise of non-duality, या फिर monism. So this was a gradual development of the Vedic thought or the Indian thought. And that is basically the standard interpretation of Western academia about Hinduism. So that's what Surendranath Dasgupta is trying to say. But then there is another alternative interpretation which challenges this Western interpretation. And that was given by Ananda Kumaraswamy, an excellent Orientalist scholar, you may call him, but he was also a perennialist. इसका मतलब इनका मानना ये था कि सब religions एक ही बात कहते हैं, and there is like a common source which all of them point towards. So he believed that no, Hinduism is actually monotheistic. And he argued that Vedic religion has a divine unity in multiplicity and it doesn't have a dogma. जो हमें क्रिश्चियनिटी या फिर इस्लाम में दिखाई देता है वो हिंदुइज्म में नहीं है, इसके बावजूद वो मोनोथीइस्टिक है. So it basically talks about a kind of multiple realizability of a single first principle, कि एक ही देवता है which can be multiply realized depending on the functions that the deity plays in particular roles. So अग्नि, मित्र, वरुण ये सब एक ही प्रिंसिपल से आते हैं. उसको प्रजापति कह लो या फिर उसको तुम ब्रह्म कह लो, all of them originate with the first principle. ये मानना था कुमारस्वामी का. And he does cite some good evidence in favor of this. So this was actually an excerpt from his Vedic monotheism paper or article that he published. The first is basically from the Rigveda itself, from 8th Mandala, 58 Sukta, verse 2. It says, one only fire is kindled, manifold, one only sun is present to one and all, one only dawn illuminates this all. That which is only one becomes all. So wonderful verse. And then he also cites Yaska, you could say he was a grammarian. And even Yaska in Nirukta expresses a similar idea where he says, and I quote, it is because of his great divisibility, Mahabhagyat, that they apply many names to him, one after the other. The other gods, Devaha, came to be, Bhavanti, sub-members, Pratyangani, of the one spirit, Ekasyatmana. Their becoming is a birth from one another. They are of one another's nature. They originate in function, that is karma, but the spirit is their origin. And the spirit, or Atman, is the whole of what a god is. So wonderful paragraph from Yaska in Nirukta, which clearly demonstrates the idea that there is a first principle, and the first principle is multiply realizable. So that's basically the idea of Vedic monotheism, unity which can be manifested in multiple things. But ultimately, it's the one and the same thing. And this is also something that, as I said earlier, is reverberated throughout ages in sectarianism. For example, in Vaishnavism, where it is said, Sarva Deva Namaskaraha Keshavam Pratigacchati. So it basically says it doesn't matter to whom you pray to, all prayers finally go to Vishnu. So the same idea is being echoed. So now we understand that, okay, there is something called Hinduism. And now we have understood that, okay, there is elements of both polytheistic and monotheistic, but it is fundamentally a monotheistic religion, which has, basically you can say unity and diversity. And then we understood that Hinduism constitutes a Vedic orthopraxy and some local traditions that were integrated into Vedic Hinduism. So that brings us to the most fundamental question: what is the structure of Hinduism? And what I mean by that is, what are the fundamental texts of Hinduism? So we have 4 layers of texts as the earliest Vedic literature. This is also referred to as Shruti. And we have Samhita, which forms the foundation. Those are basically incantations, mantra. Then we have Brahmana, which are interpreting the ritualistic elements of the incantations. Then we have Aranyaka. So Aranyakas take a different approach to the interpretation given in the Brahmanas and the incantations in the Samhitas. They are still talking about the ritual, but the approach that they are taking is slightly different. And this is where we see the seed, where they are trying to internalize the external ritual. And finally, it leads to the Upanishads, the crux of early Vedic literature. And there are many major Upanishads considered to be as Mukhya Upanishad. And so every Samhita has a corresponding Brahmana, Aranyaka, and Upanishad. For example, in the Ruga Samhita, we have Aitreya and Kaushita, Brahmana, same is with the Aranyaka, and there are also Upanishads with the same name. Then we come to Shukla Yajurveda and Krishna Yajurveda. All these are Yajurvedic texts. So we have Taittiriya Brahmana, Taittiriya Aranyaka, and Taittiriya Upanishad associated with Taittiriya Samhita. Then we have Kathaka Samhita, which has a Brahmana named Katha, the same name, Aranyaka. And then we have Katha and Maitri as the Upanishads associated with them. Finally, we have Vajasani, which has Shatapatha Brahman, Shatapatha Aranyaka, and then we have Bruhad Aranyaka Upanishad, which is a very interesting Upanishad. So that's basically the structure of Hinduism. Those are the building blocks of Hinduism. And on top of this, we have the superstructure, which is basically the Dharma Shastras, Dharma Sutras. Then we have Ramayana, Mahabharata, Puranas, and then we have the Shada Darshana, the formal philosophical systems of ancient India. So all of those are basically built on the foundation of these texts. That's the superstructure that's built on this thing.